Welcome to the fifth screencast of Thinkin Tags, and this time I want to introduce you in detail to the DOM and CSS Inspector of Thinkin Tags. This is the heart of the application, and if you're a web developer and familiar with the Chrome DevTools or the Firebug extension from Firebug, you will really love the freedom that you have in this part of Thinkin Tags. I already opened the CSS Inspector, and you can do this by clicking on this button that you can find on the bottom of the right panel. And here we have on the left side the complete DOM tree of the layout, beginning with the body element, and by clicking here I can select elements in the same way I can do this by clicking in the working area or in the breadcrumb navigation. And on the right you find this typical list of CSS selectors that match the current element with all their defined properties, as well as the list of inherited properties that get this element from its parents. Now let's come to the various manipulation features of the CSS Inspector, and I will start by showing you how to quickly disable and enable styles. So when you take a look at the title of my website that I've selected, then by clicking on the small light bulb here before the font size property, I can easily disable or enable this property. By clicking on the plus icon here, I can add new properties, and you can see there's an auto-completion here for the properties and values. And wow, this is a almost invisible light blue, so let's remove it, and removing is easy as well. Just click the delete icon at the end of the row. These are the basic editing functions, and now to show you how it feels like working with Thinkin Tags, I want to add a little 3D effect to my sidebar, and therefore I'm looking for the sidebar ID and start by adding a perspective CSS property from the transforms module of the CSS3 specs. So I set the value to 1000, and now you can see that Thinkin Tags not only creates the perspective property but also the necessary vendor prefix properties for WebKit, Mozilla, Opera and Microsoft. So the result is completely cross-browser from the beginning. So this was a little preparation, and now I add an additional class here called Rotator. Okay. Create the new selector Rotator. And now, as the element is still active in my layout, I can immediately use this selector and add some new properties. And I start with a background so that we can see our sidebar and the 3D effect. And I'm choosing some light red background, and now I will add a border radius with 6 pixels. And when I now deselect the element to remove this overlay, we can see the border radius definition is there. Now let's add the 3D effect, and I'm using the transform property, and I will use a small rotation in the y-axis -15 degree. So here again you can see that Thinkin Tags generated not only the transform property but also the necessary vendor prefixed versions, while the border radius definition doesn't have any vendor prefix. This is because Thinkin Tags uses the recommendations from the website HTML5 Please to decide whether a vendor prefix is necessary or not. And in the case of border radius, all modern browsers support this property for many versions. So let me animate this a little bit just to show you another very interesting feature of the CSS Inspector, and this is that the application allows to control the typical mouse events: focus, hover, and active. And therefore I create a new selector to control the hover state, and this is rotator hover. And yes, we don't have the hover state active right now, that's why this selector isn't to be seen. And now I can trigger it here to activate the hover state. And now this hover state is activated manually, and I can modify my selector here and add a new transform rule to rotate this element back to 0 degree, and to animate it I add a transition here of 1 second. So I can switch back to the standard mode, and now let's look what we have done. And as you can see, it's perfectly animated. Every time I come over the sidebar with my mouse, it rotates back to 0 degree, and this is really nice. And this is why I love Thinkin Tags, because with the auto-completion and the automatic creation of vendor prefixed properties, it makes it very easy and funny to play with all the new CSS3 features within the application. Now let me go a little more into detail here. So when you want to edit these vendor prefixed properties, then there are some rules here. The first is when you edit the property without vendor prefix, then the value that you set to this property will be taken over to all the other properties that have vendor prefixes. While when I edit, for example, this WebKit transform property here, then its value is only used for this single property. So if you want an individual value for a single browser, then write the property without vendor prefix first, and afterwards correct the vendor prefixed version of the browser you want to address. And when you want to have the same value for all versions of this property again, then you only have to set the value for the property without vendor prefix. There's one exception I have to mention here, and this exception is related to CSS3 gradients. As you might know, there are several versions of the specifications for the syntax of how you can create CSS3 gradients in different browsers. And that's the reason why I decided that at the moment Thinkin Tags doesn't automatically create the vendor prefixed versions here for you because of the different browser support. So when you want to use gradients here, then you have to write every prefixed version for your own. Now I have shown you almost all features of the CSS Inspector, and the last thing that is left is the button Toggle Shorthands, and as you might guess, it visualizes the individual properties that you can set when you use shorthand values like the background value, as you can see here, or when you use margin or padding, then you can see the individual values for each direction. And with this, I'm at the end of the screencast. Thank you very much for watching, and have much fun with Thinkin Tags. Bye bye.